Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Road to Recovery podcast. This podcast is a platform for education, discussion, and conversations on mental health. I'm your host, Amira Shah, and in this podcast, you'll get to know more about the therapeutic process, insight into life from the perspective of the psyche, and also join me in exploring current issues with other practitioners. I specialize in grief, but I'm always interested in learning about the human experience of the mind, heart, and spirit. So join me on this journey of in-depth learning about ourselves and the world we live in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Science of the Soul. Today I have with me Jim Schirmer. Jim is a therapist, a lecturer, a writer, and almost a doctor. How I got to know Jim is through the Masters of Counseling program at university where I was his student, and I just never left his we never left him alone. So, thank you so much, Jim. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your background and your research?
Yeah, sure. So you came into counseling and psychotherapy from a bit of a different angle. So originally I studied topics like philosophy, ethics, and theology, and then came into counseling from that direction. So quite different. A lot of people come through something like social work or psychology. And so I've always had an interest in connecting those two fields together. So in the end, I've been able to sort of do a bit of that in my research in terms of looking at traditions of ethics, looking at traditions of philosophy, and how they actually inform this strange practice we call therapy.
How did you end up in a university?
A really good question. So while I was off doing my, philosophy and ethics and theology training and, growing my hair long and, drinking lots of red wine and, doing all those sorts of silly things, I was also a youth worker and was working a lot in a variety of communities. But what I was discovering was that the bit that I enjoyed about youth work were the conversations. So it might be taking someone on a trip in a car and the conversation you have with a young person there, or occasionally at an event, someone talking a bit deeper about what's going on for them in their life. And so it came to a point, as some youth workers do, where the program I was in ran out of funding and I was at a loose end. And so I decided to go back to study my master's. And because I was attracted to those deeper conversations, that was why in the end I chose to study counselling.
And how did you end up teaching counseling? I've always been very curious how that happened.
Yeah, again, probably in the same sort of way. I feel like I fell into it a little bit. So I, after finishing my studies, I went into practice. So I was a school counsellor initially. And after a couple of years of that, one of the teachers within the program here reached out and asked if I was interested in tutoring a skills class. So I started off as a tutor, and that was a really good experience, working with a small group of people, so about 12 or so practitioners, and really right at the beginning of their training. It's amazing. Anyone who's been into training as a counsellor knows this feeling is you go in, you've got a sense of yourself as a helper, as someone who's probably a good listener, probably someone that their friends turn to for help. And then you sit down in your first skills class and you find out about all the ways in which you're not listening to people. And you do these awful exercises where you do role plays and they get recorded and you have to watch yourself back on video, which no one likes. But then really through a process, it's almost a bit more like apprenticeship or coaching or mentoring. You're not only learning skills, but you're really learning that disposition or that presence to be able to sit with someone and to listen well, to give undivided attention, to hear what they're trying to say and reflect that accurately rather than what it is you think you hear. And so to be in a position where I was sort of over a series of weeks helping people to develop that presence and that disposition, that was a really rewarding piece. And that was my first taste of it. Later down the track, I was, asked to do some guest lecturing. Then one day in, I think, late January, I was given a call saying, "Hey, we've had one of our lecturers pull out at the last minute. Would you be interested in taking a whole course and coordinating a course in relationship counselling?" Which I'd never really done before. They said, "Yeah, that starts in about 4 weeks." And I said, "Yep, let's make this happen." And then a couple of years down the track, again, it kind of came where there was a full-time position, a contract for a year. And so I stepped into that and yeah, haven't sort of looked back since. Yeah.
Kind of like you were always meant to do this.
Look, maybe I still describe myself as a fake academic because I see such intelligent people and faces and all sorts of disciplines, nursing, social work, midwifery, and I do still have a lot of forward fear. But look, ultimately, when I still see myself as a practitioner, I still introduce myself as a counsellor first. And even though, you introduced me as a lecturer, I mean, I'd like to try as best I can to be a teacher.
Sure.
And I think those two things, having that balance between practice and teaching, I hope it makes me better at both, because when I'm seeing with a client, I still do client work. I'm often thinking about, what I've been teaching my students and putting that into practice. And likewise, when I'm with my students, I'm trying to bring that practice lens to what I do.
I found that was quite interesting as well when I was lecturing for those couple of years
Mm.
whilst seeing clients and also doing the research. I found that I had so much more to give,
Mm.
and it was whatever that I was delivering in terms of education. It had so many different lens. Like I could speak from therapist point of view, I could speak from someone who knows the literature as well, from research point of view, so that's an academic lens, and then just from being a person as well, the
Mm.
relationship that you have with your students, especially if it's, a class that you kind of hold for the whole semester. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. That was such a special mode to be in. And you've been as a teacher, as a researcher, and as a practitioner.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's cool. Like you've been in this zone for how long now?
Look, in terms of being in it, I think it's over 10 years at some level, but since about 2017, where I've been predominantly based at the university and, as I say, maintaining a little bit of practice on top of that. So, but it's special. And I think I mean, teaching is a different form of helping, obviously, that's what's emerged to me anyway. And, my big joy is, seeing people like yourself, seeing where my students end up going. And, when people are able to do more than something that I would have ever been able to do. I don't run a podcast. I don't do the kind of research that you do. I mean, you've taken those skills that you learned in that time and been able to build on that and take that in new directions. I mean, that's a real joy to be part of that process and to see how people continue to build on it. So I think when you approach teaching as a helping profession, so it's heart work, not just head work, I think that's a really rewarding vocation.
No, 100%. And just now you talked about, feeling like a fake academic.
Mm.
I mean, at the end of the day, we can have all the knowledge and intellect, but I think what is most highly regarded, and this is just my opinion, is wisdom.
Obviously, hopefully we'll talk a bit about this, but as someone who's interested very much in the topic of virtue, I mean, a concept like wisdom is interesting because you can believe just for someone to be truly wise, well, yeah, you can't fake that. And at the same time, I think if you ascribe wisdom to me, it's not necessarily, yeah, something I would see in myself. I sort of see, or there's people I look up to as wise, and you kind of think, oh, there's still a fair bit to develop there. But I mean, it is a fascinating question, isn't it? Is the difference between knowledge and wisdom, and the role say, in higher education of actually learning wisdom, not just learning the text, not just learning the science, but what does it mean to cultivate wisdom?
Mm. Do you do a lot of that in class? I guess it's your angle when you're teaching, do you lean towards, ethical practice and, developing virtues and morality, things like that?
Well, it's really interesting because I suppose the philosopher in me wants to define the difference between ethics, virtues, and morals. But there's that sense in which I don't know if to be precise whether you can use all those terms interchangeably. I mean, obviously, I want ethical practitioners out in the field, and I've done a lot of teaching in the field of ethics specifically, and some writing in that area. But often when I say that, I have to kind of reclaim it a little bit because for a lot of people, and particularly anyone that's been in a profession, I mean, ethics gets reduced to your codes, right? There's something written on a piece of paper that is saying what sort of behaviors are encouraged, what forbidden, and sort of I'm just like, oh well, I follow that and then I'm ethical. And one way that I put this is that let's say that you read the code of ethics of the Australian Counselling Association or the Queensland Teaching College or the Psychologists, the Australian Psychological Association. Let's say you read that code of ethics beginning to end, which I don't know if a lot of professionals have ever done. Say you even memorize it, right? That someone can quiz you on it. You could sit an exam and you could do 100%, response rate to the code of ethics of your profession. Would that in itself make you a good practitioner? And most people would go, well, no, right? Like there's something a bit beyond that. And so then you start to ask questions of, well, what does make a good practitioner? What do you regard as a good teacher or a good psychologist or a good counsellor or a good nurse or a good police officer? And then people start to use a whole range of different terms, right? Whether it's, I really want my police officer to some self-control, to be able to regulate themselves really well, or I want them to be impartial and fair. I probably want them to be courageous at times, or I want my nurse to be caring, but I also want them to be diligent. I want them to have attention to detail. Or in counselling, it's often, I want someone who's, really respectful, non-judgmental, who's humble, who's wise. And so these sorts of words come up. And in ethics, there's this big tradition, which is the field of virtue ethics, which picks up on all these sorts of words. And so I'm interested in, well, what does it actually take to be able to integrate and grow in those sorts of virtues, which in common language, in common conversation, people would use as ways of describing professionals.
Hey everyone! As you might know, my work often centers around grief and trauma. I'm excited to share 2 resources that I've developed to help in these areas. First, my children's book titled The Truck Family is designed to help kids navigate grief in a meaningful way. Many of us were not taught about grief and loss as kids, but let's allow our young ones these days to explore it in a supportive way. It's available as an ebook, a soft copy, and an audiobook. You can find it on my website at aroadtorecovery.com. That is AROAD2recovery.com. The second resource is the Culturally Informed Trauma Workbook. It's a practical tool for both individuals and practitioners alike, filled with interactive materials to support ongoing healing. You can also find this on my website or on gumroad.com. That is GUMROAD.com. I hope these resources can provide the support and guidance you're looking for. If you want more information about them, please check out the respective podcast episodes on them. Now, let's get back to our show. Yeah, I guess tell us a few things about your journey and also what you've learned
Hmm.
as a result of your research. Because I don't want to give like a, very direct question.
Yeah, sure. My research has really focused in on virtue in the practice of psychotherapy. So I'll probably talk specifically about it for a bit, and maybe we'll broaden it out, hopefully for some listeners that might not be interested in that field exactly. But I mean, so in psychotherapy, some of the big things that I've learned is firstly, we've really established over the last 30 years or so that the person of the therapist makes a difference in the outcome of therapy. And again, most people are probably unsurprised by that. That the person, the individual that you go to see matters. What's interesting about that is that something in comparison to something like the type of therapy that you receive, comparing different evidence-based therapies, when you look at that as a variable, you get very little influence on the outcome from that. So again, I talk to people like nurses, and I would sort of say something like, imagine if you had 30 different evidence-based medicines that you could give to someone. But and whether you choose medicine A or B or C will really have very little difference, if any difference, on the outcome. However, the nurse that administers that medication will have will influence the outcome somewhere between sort of 5 to 10% of the variance in outcome will could be attributed to the individual practitioner. And that's pretty much the scenario we've got in counselling and psychotherapy. It's about that sort of 5 to 10% range, and that's a really robust finding. And so then the question is, obviously, in the nursing example, if you're the patient lying in the bed, you're given that information. Your next question will be, well, which nurse is going to give me the better outcome? Fine. And probably so the first thing I've really learned is that, we've got this established finding of therapist effects. The second thing I've really learned is we don't know an awful lot about what makes some therapists different from others. Compared to tens of thousands of studies into therapies, our studies, our robust studies on therapist variables, I mean, they number in the dozens. Like
Wow.
it's sort of it'd be less than 100, where it's actually been researched with the kind of rigor that could lead to good conclusions. And so it's just so for something that makes such a big difference on the outcome of anyone that's going to go to therapy, anyone that's going to go to counselling, we actually don't have a lot of good knowledge in that area. Yeah.
Are these studies, because I'm pretty sure you've gone through a lot of the literature, are these studies generally the outcomes are collated based on self-reporting measures?
In terms of
Like the efficacy of a therapist or a certain type of modality, is it self-reporting usually?
in the way that a lot of things, I mean, it's hard to summarize when you talk about outcome studies.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of different symptom measure, and again, in the field of psychometrics,
Okay.
a lot of that self-report. Yeah.
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 Because I think in therapy, self-reporting is quite valuable, right?
Yeah.
It is the perceived subjective experience of the person feeling better. But I also wonder, just curious, wonder, if typically it's psychometric tests or is it, the self-reporting and if there's any crossovers, but that's a conversation for another time.
Because it does tie back into this idea of virtue, though. Because
Yeah.
again, where one of the things that we've hit a snag with is that while we would, in common conversation, attribute virtue words to therapists, whether it's to be warm, to be respectful, to be wise, to be humble, whatever those words might be. One of the things about virtue is to study it is very difficult because we can easily misattribute words or characteristics to people from a small sample of their behavior, right? So if I see you at your best on a day where you might be highly compassionate or courageous or something like that, I might walk away and say, Amiri is a courageous person. And our wonderful psychology friends would sort of say, that's a pretty big attribution to give to someone from a small sample. And on the converse, if I saw you on a day when you were at your worst, when you might be mean spirited, or how do we actually measure a trait? And that's where something like self-report or either other reports is very difficult. However, there's been some interesting models that have developed, which is more about actually getting samples of people's experience over time. So if you're able to then build that up, and some of the methods have become more feasible because we've all got smartphones, and so you can actually collect lots of little different bits of data. And when we've done that, one of the things there's two things that come out which help to establish the idea of a trait. And one is that people, while they might have a big spectrum of behavior across a whole range of different states, they do tend towards an average way of being, right? People do tend to act in a way that's consistent with themselves. And in that way, it's also interesting that different people will have different averages. So it's sort of like people act in a way that's consistent with themselves, but also different to others. And that is how, if you know someone well enough, it might make sense to say something like, John is more honest than Sally, right? And when we make a description like, if we've seen enough of that person, it's like, what we're really saying is, in situations that demand honesty, I see the type of behaviors that accompany honesty more consistently in John than I do in Sally. And so we actually have some of the structure in which we can study something like virtue. However, I suppose we're now applying that science, or at the point of applying that science, a little bit more to something like professional practice of therapists. But I think all of it's got some real potential.
That sounds super interesting.
I'm glad you say that. I'm sitting here wondering whether everyone's turned off the podcast at this point.
What comes to my mind is marriage,
Mm,
because it is probably family relationships, but also
yes.
marriage. It's probably one of the longest relationships that you'll have consensually. You would have seen each other through so much of time where one person is just not the best person, but that stables up. And to be able to make conclusions when one partners are maybe struggling and going through a hard time, or having, a mental health episode,
Yes.
or some sort of crazy transition, to generalize that is actually not very compassionate.
Yeah.
Because you don't have, well, I'm just kind of extrapolating from come up with the conclusion that this person is, a douchebag, for example, or
Yes.
she's just mean spirited, or
Yes.
vicious or vindictive. Like,
Yeah.
when someone's in pain, they can have certain thoughts. It just doesn't mean that it will act out upon it. And maybe if they do, it might have been just a one-off or
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
So yeah, just that's what came to my mind is, again, temporality, that you need time to gather this sort of data. So is there a time span that these researchers?
I mean, research being research, again, it's probably not ideal. I mean, some of those like experience sampling studies, again, it's about capturing frequent data, so maybe 6 to 8 times a day, maybe over a period of something like 2 to 3 weeks. So it's actually fairly limited in that regard. I mean, compared to a year-long or decades-long marriage, which is very different. And again, and obviously with a scientific gaze, it's with that sort of precision of we are really looking for something in particular. I think the thing about everyday life, though, is a really important thing, which is, obviously we're seeing people over a period of time, but then we've also got all of those cognitive functions, again, which psychology has really helped to alert us to, which is that we don't treat every new instance of someone's behavior on its own terms. we fit it into a bigger narrative that we've created. And so we shortcut, we create a totalizing narrative of that person. And so when we see things that affirm that, we kind of fit it in. When we see things that are against that, we tend to ignore it. We also do it according to patterns of previous relationship, which was one of the great psychoanalytic insights. Virginia Satir, the family therapist, had this saying that, if you bring me into a room of 12 people, I will have met everyone I've ever met. And what she's meaning by that is I'll just relate to someone according to certain features of that person, So, if they are of a particular gender and a particular age and a particular look, I'll transfer all of those patterns that I developed with previous relationships with people with those features and start to treat them that way. And so there is that sense in which we, create these narratives of people. To link it back to the virtue question, though, I think what's important about that is that, and one of the reasons why in somewhere like psychology and in more of your sort of hard research studies, that people have tended away from virtue is it gets caught up in that moralizing sort of sense. So again, we talk about the difference between some of these words. And so it has connotations of purity or perfection. And so we see virtue as a dichotomy. You've got it or you don't. You're wise or you're foolish. You're compassionate or you're mean-spirited. You're humble or you're proud. In that I said a newer way of looking at virtue, and that's true in science. It's also true in the way philosophy's gone the last 50 years. To see virtue more as a scalar kind of concept. So it's in degrees, right? You can be more or less courageous. You can be more or less wise. And I think that's useful for research. It's also useful for everyday life. So rather than categorizing someone as, they are mean, or my husband, never listens, or my partner never does this, or is always, not self-controlled, or whatever else, all of these sort of hard categories, to actually see people as on a spectrum, on a scale. I think that's a much more realistic way to be able to think and talk about ourselves and other people.
Hello, dear listeners. If you would like to reclaim control over your nervous system, navigate your grief, your trauma, or deal with cultural matters that are causing you distress, I invite you to book in with me for a free 15-minute consult. In this consult, I will learn about your concerns, provide you with some tools and techniques to calm your nervous system, as well as give you a customized treatment plan. Simply jump onto my website to book online, or you can email me at hello@roadtorecovery.com. That is AROAD2recovery.com. And you talked about, the role of virtues in therapist practice, and you're touching on the role of virtues in human living. How does this influence or impact your way of being?
The topic in terms of virtues, yeah, I guess if we can apply it to the therapy setting first.
Yeah.
I think there's a lovely phrase that comes out of a couple of authors, Oakley and Cocking. They wrote a book about virtue ethics in professional practice in 2001. And they use this phrase, which I think is really, really underrated, and which I'm hoping becomes more common. They have this idea of a regulative ideal, right? An ideal that regulates. And so at one level, virtue sits as an ideal, right? It sits in kind of a perfect form. and often we'll use it, say, to describe the good therapist, right, or an ideal therapist. Or, in other parts of life, we might say, if you think about someone who's a real role model, someone you look up to, what are the qualities you admire? And so you paint this picture. But it's not just an ideal that sits in a utopian sort of way, but rather we then use that ideal to contrast with ourselves, right? So, for instance, one of the virtues I think of in therapy is something like honesty. And honesty is multidimensional. Part of it's about authenticity or sincerity, that I'm being real with a person. Part of it's about sort of candor, so that I'm being able to, accurately represent to another person what's going on in my mind and what's going on in my internal states. Part of it's about integrity or trustworthiness. You know, so and you kind of think about honesty has got all of those. So if I'm going to be trustworthy, I'm going to be sincere or authentic, I'm going to be candid with someone, and I've got that as an ideal. And so then I'm sitting across from a client, and depending on what they're bringing, I'm then regulating or moderating my own behavior with that idea of honesty in my mind, right? So, if I'm hearing a person and I think that they're being really hard on themselves, right? I think that the type of judgment that they're putting on themselves really isn't fair. Then I'm sort of thinking about, how do I communicate this, right? How do I communicate something that's authentic, that's candid, but that will build trust with this person, that's sort of connected with that. And then I'm thinking about I'm also co-regulating that with other virtues. How do I do that also in a way that's compassionate or respectful? And maybe I also need to employ something like courage here, because this might be a bit of a challenging conversation. So I sort of employing these other things, and then I'm thinking about, so what sort of mindset do I need to have? What is my own self-talk? And what sort of posture, what sort of tone of voice, what sort of pattern of speech am I going to kind of employ that is influenced by that ideal of honesty in this moment? Now, part of my research was talking with practitioners about how they did it. And what was really interesting was, again, things like patterns of speech, that as people were describing their practice, they often just in the interview, I didn't ask them to do this, they'd often just spontaneously start to talk as if they were in a therapy session, so they would start to kind of give examples of how they would say things. And so, in their habits, they had already sort of started to go, given a set scenario, it's like, well, I'll probably go, hey Dave, I'm just wondering about what you've just said. Then it was that kind of nature of speech, but the way that they'd found ways to, communicate in a way that was regulated by those virtues and by their pictures of those ideals. Yeah.
What practitioners would have learnt through their training would have included virtues and regulating that, and then they, over time, bring that into their lives and how they end up just being.
Yeah. And I think that's you asked a question earlier about, do I use this in the classroom? And I think the interesting thing about that is, yes, they would have learned that, but probably not explicitly. So that was one of the other things that was interesting about my research, was asking people about how virtue is developed, or to tell stories about how they see themselves having grown in virtue. No one, right? Not one said, oh, I went to this professional development workshop.
Yeah.
Or, oh, there was that lecture that, that guy gave 1 week about virtue ethics, and then I walked away and I was more honest, right? What people talked about was experience.
Right.
What people talked about was role models. What people talked about was being in settings that balanced challenge and support. People talked about taking risks and doing experiments, trying something out and seeing what happens, right?
they people almost had to employ those virtues.
Philosophical traditions, spiritual traditions, the idea of acting as if people use that phrase in that way. I often say something like, doing something difficult until it becomes easy, but it's because you're not faking it, you're doing it.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you're integrating it through that process. And I think, but then I think in terms of what do people pick up in their training? Well, in education, particularly higher education, there's these really interesting concepts like the hidden curriculum, right?
Hmm.
And so it's sort of like you get taught a whole bunch of stuff explicitly, but then underneath all that, there's a hidden curriculum. There's messages that you're picking up. So, for instance, why does some material get prioritized and other material get left out, right? Just that very fact of what the person teaches you and what they don't teach you is communicating a value, and you pick up on that. So, if you get taught, say, in psychotherapy, all about diagnosis,
Mm.
right? Then all of a sudden you've picked up on a value of I've got to arrive at a diagnosis. If you get taught nothing about self-care, it means that what's communicated to you is that's not important.
Mm.
I think in counselling we do this a little bit better. In some of our closed professions, I think psychology certainly, absolutely, in something like medicine, some hidden curriculum that's getting picked up are things around, never make mistakes, right? And it's not okay to be unhealthy,
Mm.
right? And so what we then get, I say it's been observed in psychology in Australia. It's very much observed in medicine, probably observed in places like the Defence Force as well. I know there's been some big reports come out, is that people underreport things like mental health
Mm.
because they feel like if I do that, I'm not a good doctor. If I do that, I'm not a good soldier. If I do that, I'm not a good psychologist. And there might be systemic ramifications for that. So that's an example of the hidden curriculum where it's sort of like, you know, this is, you're getting these messages, these subtle discourses about this is what it is to do this profession. And I think we communicate virtues too. So whether that's about, and maybe not even traditional virtues, right? Like it might be, yes, it might be that you're meant to be kind, or maybe you get that sense of, to be a counsellor, I'm meant to be compassionate. But you might not get a sense of, I need to be courageous sometimes too, or I need to be, and so all of that gets communicated and we pick up on it, even if it's never said explicitly.
Certain virtues or pairs or clusters
Mm.
that kind of go against each other, contradict
Excellent.
each other.
Yeah, yeah. Really excellent question. I think that's another thing that I'm really keen to keep learning about and developing because I actually do think it's better to think about virtues as co-informing. And as I gave an example before, there's ways in which to try to practice one virtue, you need to try to employ others, right? But then you've kind of got things that sort of might, occasionally pull against each other, right?
Yeah.
You know, to to be honest in this circumstance might mean that I have to be unkind or I might have to hurt feelings. And so it's all of these sorts of things where it's like, how do I negotiate between potentially clashing virtues? And I mean, and that's just the nature of ethics. I mean, it's a dilemma.
Yeah.
It's one of those things. What I think's interesting is some dilemmas are sort of choosing between two evils, to choosing the lesser of two evils,
Yeah.
which is a very particular type of dilemma. And people have the trolley problem where it's one of those thought experiments where it's like, there's a runaway train and it's about to hit 5 people, but you can pull a lever and divert it to another track where you can hit one person. These awful, awful scenarios that philosophers have to sort of torture first year moral philosophy students. You have to choose between the lesser of two evils, right? What do you do then? A really underrated dilemma is when you're choosing between two competing goods. Anyone that's been in a circumstance where they have two job offers on the table, right? Or, maybe they're mulling up, they've got two potential romantic relationships that are on the potential of becoming something more. And we can kind of it's sort of disenfranchise that a bit and sort of say, oh, well, what have you got to complain about, But anyone that's been in that position knows the experience of the moral churning that goes on in those sorts of things. And so to do one will mean saying no to something else. And I think there is that element in some of our ethical dilemmas where we're sort of choosing between two goods and we're trying to rank value different things. And it's underrated as a form of moral experience that we have, and how much we agonize over that. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering this point because we're talking about things, well, virtues as these words, concepts that are quite fluid as well. They're not static and they are in relationship with each other. I'm also thinking about for something like that, the best way to learn, which is in therapy, the best way to learn is through exposure and discussing the morals and virtues and ethics and what goes on for them. And what comes to my mind is the greater good, doing the greater. Yeah, like I remember my husband told me that once upon a time he held this tiny little broken bird and climbed like a mountain or something ridiculous for hours in his hand, only to have to kill it.
Yeah. I think what I've found useful about virtue as an ethical form, though, and more so probably compared to other forms of ethics that really try to distill, a hard rule. One is that idea of a regulative ideal. Other philosophers have called that, we almost have, they call them V rules, virtue rules, So when we say something like kindness is a virtue, what we say is that something like be kind, right? That there's actually an imperative, or be courageous, or be temperate. But then I suppose what's interesting in that tradition is the idea of, well, how does that then get applied? So, and this is where I'm trying to fill in some blanks in my research, in my writing. I suppose at its broadest form, and again, there's traditions in philosophy that talk about this. How does a regulative ideal work? How do we sort of step that through? Well, there seems to be firstly a process of perception. So, when we're in a situation, we're asking a question, or even if we're not asking the question, we're coming to some sort of conclusion about what kind of terrain am I in right now, right? What is the nature of this particular situation? And why that's important is because virtues, when you unpack them, connect to particular spheres of living, right? So something like courage is connected to the part of living that requires us to take risk on something of value, right? Something like honesty, is related to the part of living that has to do with truthfulness and trustworthiness in relationship, right? And so you sort of go, well, when you sort of start to unpack the virtues, then there might be a bit of a process where it's like, what sort of terrain am I in as a person or as a professional, right? All right, now I'm in a therapeutic terrain, which may require some sort of honesty, or may require some sort of humility or respect or something like that. And then that's sort of the second step, is to think about, so what will be of value here? What sort of virtue? So there's a valuation step, what kinds of things will enable me or will help me in this particular terrain? And then how might I express it given the circumstances? How might I then actually put this into practice? So I think in terms of, well, how do we integrate that into our lives? It's through that sort of process of, well, okay, to give you the example, here I have, an injured creature that's in, severe pain, that isn't going to survive. well, maybe that's going to require me to have some sort of compassion for the creature, but also courage to maybe bring about the end of its life to end its suffering. I mean, that seems to be the sort of and so like even though I'm going to do something that I otherwise wouldn't do, I need to draw on those parts of myself, the courageous part, the compassionate part, because I'm seeing this as the right thing to do or the greater good, as you said. Yeah.
It's such complex terrain.
It's living and
Yeah.
it's and Aristotle, said really wisely, we can only ever expect as much precision as the field will allow us. So, in mathematics you might have a lot of precision, you might be able to come up with a rule that brings about certain conclusions. I think in something like ethics, we can only expect so much precision in living and again to be compassionate with ourselves
Yeah.
in the face of those dilemmas.
Which is why I think there are some hard and fast rules that, we've been taught for centuries. But at the same time, the nuances, the details are so important.
Absolutely.
I mean, do not kill, yes,
Right.
but
Yeah.
however, there will be a circumstance at some point in someone's life where actually this is probably the better thing to do, like that the little bird or I don't know, Hitler.
Yeah, and that's often the way that, we can come up with all sorts of counter examples or thought experiments where we might be in that position where, or even to, scale it back, it's go like something like truth telling. We broadly agree that's a good thing and necessary for human life, for relationship, for community. But then you get the scenarios of, well, do you tell a lie to someone who's, coming to kill a friend of yours? They ask you, well, where's Jane? This is often called Kant's axeman, Immanuel Kant posed this, and it's kind of like, well, I might have to do a lie. I might have to tell a lie. Kant would say, your duty would be to tell the truth. Your moral duty, even in that circumstance. But then others would go, oh, come on, that sounds ridiculous. Like, this is exactly it, isn't it? Is even though we might agree on a certain human goods or certain aspirational sorts of rules, living will throw up all sorts of difficult situations. Yeah.
Boring, so curveballs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you one more thing that we chatted about earlier, and if you can shed some light on how the role of virtue in human daily living connects with somebody who has experienced or is experiencing, probably has experienced a traumatic event or events.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I mean, I suppose I'm interested in this question partly because of my practice area. So, for most of my counselling career, I've been involved in working with survivors of trauma, particularly war related trauma, persecution, refugee experiences, this sort of thing. And the first thing I would say in the midst of all of this, and it's really just so I don't get misunderstood, I mean, I'm in no way ever claiming that a traumatic experience or a loss or even an adversity is a good thing. I think anyone who's in this sort of field of whether it might be called strengths-based work, post-traumatic growth, positive psychology, virtue, if we're not careful, we can really undermine the experience of people by somewhat spinning adversity in a positive light.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of, well, whatever doesn't kill you only makes you stronger sort of line. And which when said as a platitude is just so empty and so invalidating, I think. So I often would say, if sometime, and this is where I'm going with this, is what we do have, though, is this description of the phenomenon of people growing through their adversity or people feeling like they've grown through their adversity, including their losses, including their traumas. I often will put to people, even when they describe that, okay, you're coming out of this saying that you're more courageous or you've got more gratitude or you're wise, got a greater perspective on life. Still, if you could trade all those things and not have experienced the trauma or not have experienced the loss or have your partner back or to never have lost your children or whatever else. I mean, most people, if you're going to weigh that up,
Yeah.
it's not to say that, oh, well, it's a good thing that those things happen. So having said all that, again, we have this really fascinating thing that can happen within those circumstances that alongside all of the real and felt experiences and impacts is that people can come out and say, I never would have wanted to have gone through, those bushfires. I never would have wanted to have lost my child. I never would have wanted to found myself in a war zone. But given that that is a fact of my history, given that that has happened, I can now see that I am, and often will insert words that sound a bit like virtues. I'm more compassionate than I ever would have been. I'm more empathic for the suffering of others. I am more resolved to do something about the injustices of this world. I have a greater perspective or generosity or gratitude, right? That people will often say, this is how that has changed me, and not all for the worse. Still a very new field in psychological research, much bigger field if you're going into philosophy, spirituality, poetry, narrative. You'll find this in, various Greek plays and, all sorts of writings all over the world will describe something like this. So it's a thought with a deep history in our psychological literature, much younger field. We're still getting our heads around how to conceptualize that. As I say, having sat with survivors of trauma particularly, and people will say things to me like, gosh, that must be hard, or you must hear a lot of, really hairy stories or sort of thing. And I know you've done similar work. It's a really hard thing to describe because sometimes with people, we're not talking an awful lot about the trauma. Sometimes what people are talking more about is, something like, having gone through this is what I want to do with my life, right? So it's making meaning out of it. It's changing our relationship to it. So like, I'm now sensitized to some things about life and I want to do something about that. I say it's something that I would never demand of people. I would never expect it of them, but spend any time in this kind of work and you'll hear that type of story. Yeah.
Something came to my mind earlier when you were speaking, and I think the concept of duality or non-duality.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's where philosophy sits more, and psychology is probably sitting more on the duality part, good and bad, like this is a bad experience. And I think we're still struggling in that field because this is study, some sort of resolution around it doesn't have to be this way because every time you go with the dichotomy, you're putting valency on things, right? And then now not only do you have valency, you have salience of valencies. And then so the way that we conceptualize our experiences is already going to be that way. And now we have to create cognitive therapies in order to feed that perception and conceptualization of our experiences. Whereas if you go down towards the philosophical or the wisdom traditions, it's more like this is an experience.
Yeah.
This is the phenomenon. And then you have the virtues that kind of like sitting all around it. And then what can you hold into the phenomenon to describe it and to deal with it? Rather than let's unpack it, understand and experience as good, bad, evil, whatever it is.
And it's a fantastic point. And I mean, a couple of things that's interesting. One, I think some of your third wave, fourth wave sort of therapies, whether it's acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, I mean, they're picking up on ideas of holding paradox intention. which is just interesting as a movement. Right? That there was a space there. But then I think, again, sometimes our virtue words help us to do that. And that's where I think they do defy that classic positive psychology, which was sort of like just contrasted with, strength versus difficulty or symptom or pathology. And the way I demonstrate would be, if you came to me and said, oh, how are you going today, Jim? And I said, oh, look, I'm doing much better now that my leg has healed.
Mm.
What would be your obvious next question?
What happened to your
What
leg?
happened to your leg, right? And so if it's something like healing, we usually give it a positive valence.
Mm.
But the word is unintelligible without the concept of injury, right? So
Right.
built into a word like healing is also the, illness, disease, or injury, right?
Mm.
And so I think that's true of some other words. Best person who ever did this, one of my absolute favorite theorists is Erik Erikson, right? And so his stages of development, which a lot of people know, but don't often know that he also attached virtues to them. So things like, so his classic first one, the infant, the developmental crisis that the infant goes through is trust or mistrust, right? Is they have wanting absolute dependence upon a caregiver, so trust. But then what they're also learning through their experience is that a caregiver isn't always there or may not be there in the way that they want to be. As someone who had kids who would scream in their car seats, right, when they're between about 6 and 12 months of age, hated being in the car. And you're driving for 45 minutes with this kid, absolute, like screaming so loud that they go silent at times,
Dogs can hear them.
As a caregiver, all I do is go, what my kid is learning is sometimes I scream and my parents don't come for me, right? And so they're encountering a world where you can't always trust, right? Now, again, classically, what we think if we don't know the theory well enough is, well, we want the infant to walk away with trust rather than mistrust. Trust is good, mistrust is bad. What Erickson was really saying is both of those things are part of the psychological need and the existential experience. What he said is the resolution of that phase is the development of hope, right? And hope is the virtue. And when we unpick a word like hope, it means I sort of have a trust in a preferred future in spite of, or maybe in the face of, the uncertainty of living, right? That's what hope. To hope doesn't mean that you're certain about the future. It's not an always positive thing. Heck, talk to anyone who's lived with hope. It's scary. It doesn't always feel pleasant, right? And so, while again we often give this, I love your use of the term valence. While we often give this a positive valence, you go, the actual existence of it is about holding paradox in tension. Again, you can go through all of Erickson's stages and do the same thing. But I think there's something about that maybe the role of virtue is how we change, how we grow to hold the mystery of existence in tension, or to face the mysteries and the perplexities of what this existence is about. And that's where I think there's something to that, is in the face of these realities that we can't change, how do we change in order to be able to live with meaning and to try to survive, thrive, flourish in the face of that.
And also promote that in others that come
Right.
way.
Yeah.
Teaching.
Yeah, as a teacher, as a partner, as a parent, as a colleague, friend. I think, creating those communities that foster that.
Yeah, because you live in relationship with others. Otherwise, you're just a tree in the woods that may or may not fall, and someone may or may not hear.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do that.
Oh wow! Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for letting me talk a lot about the things I'm interested in. Yeah, really pleasure. Yeah.
I have so many more questions, but that will be like another hour. What I will do is I will list some of the links possible. If you can provide us with some studies on virtues, and I want to also put down in the description Erik Erikson's stages, because I think it's quite important for practitioners or just people if you want to if you're struggling with somebody in your life, I feel like sometimes just putting that lens on
Mm.
makes you feel like, hey, actually, maybe this person has not graduated from this egoistic stage to, the super egoistic stage. So maybe this person might be operating largely from like a 12-year-old brain, for example. And I think that can help us cultivate or evoke a lot more compassion for the people that we work with and live with.
Yes.
So I might do that in the description below. But thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate it.
Great.
Honestly. So hopefully in the future, if you have some time or once you've submitted your thesis, you can tell us a little bit more if you don't mind.
Absolutely. I'd love to.
Yeah, and we can learn more from you. All right, well, thank you everyone for listening. Bye.